Right. Good evening, everyone, and sorry for the slight delay. We had an event preceding this one, which took us some time to empty the hall, empty the space outside, and have you guys be served hot tea and coffee. So sorry about the 15-minute delay, and sorry to the Zoom audience. We couldn't serve you tea, but you had to still wait. But thank you all for waiting and for your patience. Good evening, and welcome to the book discussion, Asia After Europe, Imagining a Continent in the Long 20th Century. I'm Monica Setia. I head the Lakshmi, Mittal and Family South Asia Institute's India office. It's a Harvard University's academic institute based out of New Delhi and Cambridge at Harvard. Before I introduce the speakers, I would like to just take a few minutes to introduce to some of you who may not know about the Mittal Institute, but we call it in short, about the Institute. Mittal Institute engages in research activities to advance and deepen understanding about critical issues relevant to South Asia. We work with faculty members, researchers, students at Harvard University, and also with the institutions in the region, which means across the South Asia region. We do offer exchange programs, fellowships. We organize events like this. We organize conferences. We give grants to Harvard faculty. We are very proactively working in countries including Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Maldives, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan. We do have smaller offices in Pakistan and Nepal, aside from Cambridge and New Delhi. I would like to pass on my sincere thanks to both Professor Sugata Bose and Jayati Ghosh for the session today. We are very grateful to all of you, the audience members, for joining us today. We had our apprehensions today that given the farmers' protest, there might be diversions, people might be scared, we may not have enough audience, but I see the house full here, so we're very happy and thank you for making it here. Also to the virtual audience who have joined us through Zoom, thank you again, and sorry about the slight delay again. I would like to pass on my thanks to HarperCollins and Harvard University Press for giving us this opportunity to do the session by bringing out the book. We have few colleagues from HarperCollins who are joining us today. Thanks, Naya. I don't know if she's in the room. I think she's there at the back of the room. Thanks, Naya, for being here along with your colleagues. The books are outside, as some of you might have seen, so you can connect with Naya and her team. Last but not the least, I would like to give a big thanks to our team at the Mittal Institute, in Delhi office, Amit, Angarika, Nishant, Sabha, and Sushma. I know some of them are in the room, not all of them. And also at the Cambridge office, because all of them came together and put together this program. Also, a big thanks to Robert, our current India fellow. I know he was very critical in many pieces of this session. So thank you, Robert. Robert is being currently mentored by Professor Bose for his fellowship. I want to take this last minute just going over very few event logistics. The session is going to take place, as you know, in the room and also on Zoom. So for the Zoom attendees, we request you to post your questions, any comments in the Q&A box. We have a person who's manning your questions. So as you put them through, we may not be able to take any questions immediately, either for the room audience or the Zoom audience. We will take it at the end, but the Zoom audience can continue to put their comments and questions in the Zoom box. Also, just for the next 90 minutes or so, maybe a little less, request you to please put your phones on mute. It's very disturbing, as you know, for everybody in the room speaking or listening. So please do so if you haven't already done that. So I'm just going to begin. I know I'm rushing because I'm also mindful of time, but I'm going to begin by introducing both our discussant and author and speaker for the evening. Professor Sugata Bose, who's a Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University. He specializes in modern South Asian and Indian Ocean history. He received his PhD from University of Cambridge and Guggenheim Fellowship in 1997. He has authored multiple books, including Majesty's opponent Subhas Chandra Bose in India's Struggle Against Empire and 100 Horizons, the Indian Ocean in the Age of Global Empire. I would also like to mention here that Professor Bose actually was the founding faculty director of the Mittal Institute. So it's really an honor and pleasure for us to have him here. Introducing Professor Jayati Ghosh, who's a development economist, currently a professor of economics at University of Massachusetts Amherst. In her previous role, she served as a chairperson of the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. After spending nearly 35 years at JNU, she moved to United States in January of 2021. She also received her PhD from University of Cambridge. She has authored and edited 20 books and more than 200 scholarly articles, with her most recent books being The Making of Catastrophe, COVID-19 and the Indian Economy, When Governments Fail, COVID-19 and the Economy, and Women Workers in the Informal Economy. She has received several awards, the list goes very long, advised governments in India and other countries, consulted on various international organizations, and she writes regularly for popular media, including newspaper, journals, and blogs. Thank you so much, Professor Ghosh. Thank you so much, Professor Ghosh. And I would like to hand over to you right away, Professor Ghosh, for taking forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's very nice to be among you to discuss yet another wonderfully written book by my old friend Sugata Bose. He keeps producing these very informative and illuminating books that are also very beautifully written. So I have to say, I do envy that capacity to keep, we economists are not particularly known for our literary flair. So this is clearly something that historians are better at, and Sugata certainly is better at. So I'm going to actually just ask Sugata a set of questions, and then maybe in that process, he will be able to reveal a lot more about this book. And I'm going to just begin with the idea of Asia. Yeah, your subtitle says imagining a continent. And yes, it's true. Asia, you think about it, and at one level, you could just say it's a creation of your European cartographers, right? I mean, it's 60% of the global population. It's this enormous geographical expanse, incredibly diverse civilizations. So what is the idea of Asia?
Well, thank you, Jayati. It's wonderful to be together with you again to discuss a new book. And let me begin by thanking Monica and her team at the Mittal Institute and Naya Singh of HarperCollins for arranging this event at very short notice. Yes, a number of years ago, two historical geographers, Martin Lewis and Karen Wigan, wrote a book titled The Myth of Continents. And it was a devastating critique of what they called European meta-geography. And I felt that it was a compelling critique, but that was not all there was to it. That at the same time as European geographers and cartographers were mapping Asia, there were a whole range of Asian thinkers, scholars, intellectuals, artists, who were trying to imagine the continent for themselves. And it seemed to me that that process of imagination contained a creative spark that was lacking in European cartographic depictions of Asia. And there were, in fact, perhaps many ideas of Asia. And I think I can best answer your question by, giving some examples. This process of Asian imagination of their own continent, I would say, began in the 1880s, contesting what European geographical societies were doing from the 1870s onwards. But it's from the very beginning of the 20th century that you see a new impetus. For example, Okakura Tenshin came to Calcutta in December of 1901 and spent more than a year in India. And during that time, he wrote a book titled Ideals of the East, which had a famous first sentence, Asia is one. And he actually, to my mind, had a co-author who simply wrote the introduction to the book. This was Sister Nivedita. And she added a further embellishment to Asia as one. She grandly proclaimed, Asia, the great mother, is forever one. Now, of course, Okakura was an art critic, and so he tended to, first of all, emphasize the Buddhist arc, which connected India, China, and Japan. But he was also showing how Japan, in his view, became a living museum of Asian culture. What got destroyed in the process of time, in India and Japan survived. India and China survived in Japan. And Okakura sent a couple of very fine artists to India after returning to Japan. And just to give you a bit of a visual evocation of Asia after Europe, let me show you a painting by Yokoyama Taikkan. Now, what happened here was that Abanindranath Tagore took off a large European painting from the wall of his studio and sold it to a rich art collector, Rajendranath Mollik, to create space for an Asian work of art. And Taikkan chose the theme. It was going to be Rash Leela. And he, worked on his canvas. And the painting was almost complete. But Taikkan kept saying that something is missing. Until one day he arrived in Jorashako and at home had collected shiuli flower, the white autumnal flower, which was scattered across the room. And he collected them and just decided to scatter them on his painting. And then he picked up one shiuli, looked at its white and orange colors, and then began to apply color. And then suddenly, the shiuli flowers came down like rain from the sky, and he put a kodam flower in Radha's hand, and put a bunch of shiuli around her hair. He even tied some shiuli flowers around Krishna's flute, and then ultimately he decided to frame it with a border of a baluchari sari. And it was then put up on the wall, and there was a party that was thrown to friends in Calcutta to come and watch Rash Leela. Now, these were the kinds of Asian conversations taking place. It wasn't very easy for Abanindranath Tagore initially to see for example, the touch of coal on silk, a smoky touch that Taikkan provided, because he was used to the rich colors of Mughal and Persian painting, but he soon began to appreciate what the Japanese painters were doing. And he was absolutely fascinated when he saw them putting their painting into water. And so he took the plunge himself. And that started the process of how in Indian art, the Japanese wash technique came to be used. So there were these Japanese painters who were using depicting Indian themes. This is Saraswati by Hishida Shunso. And note the white lotus flowers near the feet of Saraswati. And this painting and Kali by Taikkan was bought by Swarnakumari Devi, Rabindranath's sister, Sarala Devi Chaudhurani's mother. And then, of course, this is already in 1903, 1904. And then in 1905, with the onset of the Swadeshi movement, Abanindranath decided to produce this painting, which was initially called Bongo Mata, Mother Bengal, later retitled Bharat Mata at Nivedita's suggestion. Again, here is supposedly an iconic Swadeshi image, but which is not devoid of quite a delectable Bideshi touch, certainly a Japanese touch. So what I would say is that, in the first decade of the 20th century, there were these Asian conversations that were taking place that were infused with an anti-colonial spirit from 1905, but primarily cultural, artistic. And then it was really in the second decade of the 20th century that particularly during the years of the First World War, that you began to see a new kind of youthful daring, both in terms of intellect and politics. And maybe, I'll talk a little bit about a figure called the figure in black right in front of that painting. This is Binoy Kumar Sharkar. Now, he actually traveled to Japan and China in 1915, 1916, and spent as many as 15 months there. And what's fascinating is that, of course, he met ordinary citizens, but he met practically every major intellectual figure, cultural figure, political figure in both countries at that time. And Binay Sarkar's English writings have been studied, but I found that he wrote in Bengali, which had not actually been used by historians. And what he says, for example, at the end of his visit to Japan, is that, you know, I've been to England and America, and I could converse with people in their own language there. But he felt that he felt a certain awkwardness. In Bangla, he used the term khapchara. I felt rather khapchara, and they also couldn't really accept me wholeheartedly. And in Japan, I couldn't understand their language, but I felt that, you know, I was in the streets of Calcutta, wherever I went in Japan. And he then said that Japan is very much a part of Asia. They have only imported some lohalokkur, some scraps of iron from Euro-America. And I think it is this feeling of being awkward that was captured in that painting I was showing by Florine Stettheimer. Now, here is a man, Binay Sarkar, who was welcomed into intellectual and cultural circles in both New York and Boston. But there was a certain difference between an intellectual engagement with Euro-America. In fact, he was talking to political economists at Columbia University, by the way, and a certain kind of an affective bond with Asia. And I'll just end. I know I'm giving a long answer to your very first question, but I think it is important. What struck me in reading Binay Sarkar's Bengali writings, particularly his travelogue on China, is that he wrote that he felt a closer affinity to Chinese Muslims than to Chinese Buddhists. And he said, intellectually, I can understand the movement of Buddhism between India and China and Japan. But he said, you know, the music that sprang from my heartstrings when I met Muslims in China, why did that music not sound when I met the followers of Shakko Shingho? And then he has a beautiful lyrical passage of Hindus and Muslims in Bengal in particular, and about, you know, how they felt a sense of belonging, whether in famines or in cemeteries and so forth. And of course, part of this was very much a political project of trying to build Hindu-Muslim unity on the basis of equality. And I'm particularly emphasizing this because Binay Sarkar has been rather misinterpreted by another historian of late, you know, comparing him to Savarkar, for instance. He could not have been more different if you read him carefully, because once he came back to India, he became a great follower of C.R. Das and his project of equality and unity between Hindus and Muslims. So through these examples, I've been just trying to suggest how Asia was coming to be imagined by Asians. And of course, Binay Sarkar himself also wrote English books. He wrote a book called The Futurism of Young Asia. And in fact, his China travelogue was dedicated to two great Chinese intellectuals, Kang Yu Wei and Liang Qiqiao. And so that was, you know, what was going on in the very early part of the 20th century, to try and actually forge some kind of a shared Asian, you know, cultural ecumene.
You know, what you say about Binay Sarkar reminds me of a phrase that really sprung out at me from your book, a colorful cosmopolitanism, yeah? Which is how you kind of look at a lot of the interactions between Indians, Chinese, Japanese, etc. at the time. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, you know, there is, of course, a very influential philosophical school, which tends to see cosmopolitanism as necessarily colorless, that cosmopolitanism can only be derived from Kantian abstract reason. And, you know, patriotism can be seductive, but it's antithetical to genuine cosmopolitanism. But what I try to suggest in this book, that we are dealing with Asia at a time when much of this continent is under European imperial rule, and therefore there are anti-colonial movements that are developing, not just in India, but the Philippines, Vietnam, even a country which was not fully formally colonized, China. There is new patriotic feeling. Even Japan is trying to get rid of the unequal treaties and so forth. And so here we have a scenario where there is no necessary contradiction between cosmopolitanism and patriotism. In fact, much of this new Asianism has to rest on some kind of anti-colonial solidarity. Now, there are other philosophers who have broached this issue in using somewhat different terms. Think of Anthony Appiah, who wrote about rooted cosmopolitanism rather than the rootless variety. But I thought that colorful cosmopolitanism, just overturning this dogma about colorless cosmopolitanism, was a better way of presenting the issue. And it seems to me that Asia was one venue, an expansive venue for the play of this kind of colorful cosmopolitanism. And Binoy Sarkar is a good exemplar of this, because during the Swadeshi movement, he was in his home district of Malda. And one of my students at Harvard, Aniket De, has a wonderful book called The Boundary of Laughter, where he shows how Binoy Sarkar was deeply immersed in the local culture of Malda, and particularly a particular kind of musical and folk tradition, a dramatic sort of kind of performance called Gombhira and so on. So at one level, he's deeply rooted in his own district folk culture, in Bengali Swadeshiism, but there was a dimension that was not Swadeshi nationalism. It was, in fact, Swadeshi internationalism. And so he becomes a globe-trotting intellectual. He goes both to Europe, America, and to different parts of Asia. But as I explained, there seems to be just a little different quality in the kind of bond that is forged with Asia.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on a word you used just now about universalism, because, that's another concept that I found quite interesting and intriguing about your description of all of these different Asian thinkers, which is, what was it exactly? It was competing but overlapping universalisms. Yes?
Yes. And in fact, that helps me to take the story forward a little bit, into the period after the First World War, into the 1920s. Nationalism in this period was never entirely territorially bounded. There were these Asian patriots who felt various kinds of affinities beyond the borders of their own nations. And these affinities were of different kinds. And what I try and suggest that, the post-First World War years were not really a Wilsonian moment. Wilsonian national self-determination was educed just strategically, but very quickly, Asian anti-colonial nationalists figured out that Wilsonian benevolence was restricted to Europe, did not apply to the colonies of Asia. And therefore, in a sense, the period from, let's say, 1919 to 1922 was a quintessentially Islamic universalist moment in Asia. Just think of Gandhi's first mass movement. the non-cooperation movement was entirely intertwined with the Khilafat movement. There was always this extraterritorial dimension to Indian mass nationalism in the early 1920s. And then there was, communist or Bolshevik internationalism. Post-1917, it had a tremendous appeal. And in my view, Lenin won the contest with Wilson hands down when it came to, Asian anti-colonialists. And these universalisms, and there was, of course, Asian universalism, which had had its great moment around 1905, but was still in play. And these are the universalisms which I describe as being competing, but also overlapping. And I show in this book that in parts of Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, there was a good bit of intermingling between communist internationalism and Muslim universalism, at least in the early part of the 1920s. But then, of course, you had the abolition of the Khilafat by Kemal Atatürk in 1924. And that meant that, the lamp of Asian universalism had to be lit again in a new kind of way. So, for example, even C.R. Das, whom I just mentioned a little while ago, he was the first Indian leader to talk about a future Asiatic federation from the top echelons of the Indian National Congress. He did so at the Gaya Congress in December of 1922. But from 1924, what I show is that Rabindranath Tagore, again goes on an Asian voyage. His first one was in 1916, but and he had only, gone to Japan on that occasion. But this time, he went to China as well. And again, perhaps I should show you a picture. He was welcomed by none other than Liang Qiqiao in Beijing in 1924. The other two figures in this picture are Kiti Mohan Sen, the scholar of comparative religion, Amartya Sen's grandfather, and Nandalal Bose, the painter, who again, after China, they went to Japan. And so they once again, met Taik Khan, and Nandalal saw again the masterpieces of Japanese art.
You have some wonderful frames of Nandalal's Japanese style as well. In your book.
I'll come to those a little later, because Nandalal had many Japan phases in his art, and it continued into the 1960s, as I'll mention a little later. So, but the other point to make is that, by about 1927, the concordance that had been created between communist internationalism and Asian universalism somehow broke down in a couple of places. In Wuhan, in China, because the nationalist Kuomintang Communist Alliance collapsed at that time. Tim Harper has written about it. And also in Indonesia, where Tan Malaka was a very major figure talking about Aslia, a bringing together of Asian, Islamic, and communist internationalisms. That too was crushed by the Dutch in a major wave of repression in 1927. But what I do suggest is that, Islamic universalism had a longer life than what we would be led to imagine, given the abolition of the Khilafat. Because the Khilafat Committee continued to function in the late 1920s. And what I actually show, I'm showing the next slide, this is Iqbal on the right, in the right-hand corner. And here he is at a World Islamic Conference in Jerusalem. There had been one in 1926. And then that was attended by Muhammad Ali, Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar, who had been Gandhi's very close comrade in the early 1920s. But then Muhammad Ali had died in Jerusalem. He was buried there. And so his elder brother, Shaukat Ali, along with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, arranged this wonderful conference. Iqbal came. This was in November, December of 1931. They went to the Al-Aqsa, And of course, Palestine dominated the proceedings because this was the moment in the early years of the Depression, and Palestinian peasants were being dispossessed of their lands by new Zionist settlers. So there's a strong sort of resonance with the terrible calamity that has overtaken Palestine today. And one of the things which Iqbal argued, which I take on board in this book, he suggested that, the prefix pan is unnecessary in talking about pan-Islamism. He basically suggested that this was a way to lend that term or that concept a pejorative connotation. He said Islamism should suffice if we are talking about broad Islamic solidarity. And similarly, I argue in this book that, the prefix pan is unnecessary in talking about these variants of Asianism that I have written about, in this book. So these are the various competing and overlapping universalisms that I write about for the interwar period, particularly the 1920s into the early 1930s, of which, an aspiration towards an Asian universalism was, one key element.
But also clearly, this was something that was very informed by the experience of being colonized. So I'm thinking of westwards. What about Africa, another region that was heavily colonized? It's not really mentioned so much in your book, but I think there are resonances of the kinds of things you're saying, certainly in North Africa. And
yes, but in fact, the whole of the African, continent, I think the best way to think about this question is that, the idea of Afro-Asia or Asian African really enters the political discourse somewhat later. And it's actually very influential by the 1950s. After all, the conference in Bandung was an African-Asian,
exactly.
Conference. But I think there is a prehistory, which is also worth emphasizing. And this stems from the fact that the global color line was really ubiquitous in the period that we are talking about, this interwar period. And so, quite apart from the colonized Africans, there is even a connection to be made with African Americans. And that's why in, writing about the 1930s decade, I, bring up the great African American intellectual, W.E.B. Du Bois. In fact, this photograph I obtained from the archives of your university, UMass Amherst. The Du Bois papers are there. Much of the archive is located there. Now, he was invited to Japan. He gave a series of lectures on Frederick Douglass and African American literature and so on. But what he said was that he felt that this was Asia, calling out to the 12 million oppressed African Americans. So this language of the oppressed peoples of Asia, but also Africa, including African Americans, have their origins in this period, even in the 1930s. But of course, since I want to move forward and answer your question about what happened with Africa, I'll just point out that, first of all, sometimes when you emphasize the global color line, you tended to underplay oppression that could occur along lines other than race. And so Du Bois also got criticized because he more or less gave a realist political analysis of the China-Japan conflict in 1937 after returning to the United States, saying that Japan had to take advantage of the difficulty in which Europe and the United States found itself during the Depression. And if they did not, then, they would leave China to be, conquered by the Euro-Americans. That was his line. but the problem was that it's precisely in this period that, as I show in this book, Asia seemed to be affected by the European virus of nationalist conflicts and wars, of which the most significant was Japan's invasion of mainland China in 1937. And that's why I'll just show you some pictures to skip through this quite interesting period. But so, for example, Subhas Chandra Bose sent an Indian medical mission as Congress president to China. At that stage, he was quite critical of Japan's imperialist aggression. And so you see the medical mission in Calcutta with Subhas Chandra Bose in late August of 1938. And then by mid-March of 1939, they are in Yan'an, in Mao Zedong's cave. And then, of course, these two poets had been great friends. Noguchi had met Tagore and his entourage in 1916, 1924, 1929. And then he came to India in 1935. He had a grand reception in Shantiniketan from Tagore and from Kiti Mohan Sen and so on. He stayed as a guest of Sarojini Naidu in Hyderabad. Gandhiji received him in Sevagram and so on. So relations were truly very, very close. But then these two poets differed on their interpretation of their Japan-China conflict. There was an exchange of letters, which I discuss in some detail in this book. Noguchi was saying that all that Japan was trying to do was to, as he put it, correct the mistake of Chiang Kai-shek, while Tagore took a much more critical line that Japan is imitating the worst features of European nationalistic imperialism. And then I do talk about the entire, this is very interesting. I really wanted to show you these pictures because Shu Bei-hong was one of the greatest Chinese painters of the first half of the 20th century. He had trained in Japan and in France. And while all this was going on in terms of between Japan and China, this painter came to Shantiniketan and did this wonderful portrait of Rabindranath Tagore. And at that time, Mahatma Gandhi visited Shantiniketan. I mean, I've hardly ever seen the expression on Mahatma Gandhi's face captured so well. You know, this was, but he was not just a portrait painter. He then traveled to Darjeeling, and this is the Himalayas, the view of the Kanchenjunga from Darjeeling. And then, of course, I show what happened during the Second World War. This is a very interesting painting by Nandalal. In this book, I write about, you know, even though I had written about it before, I have a somewhat new interpretation of three great wartime famines. And this is Annapurna by Nandalal, executed in a combination of tempera and Japanese wash. Annapurna has a bowl of rice in her hands, and in front of her is Shiva, reduced to a skeleton. And of course, Subhas Chandra Bose decided that he would have to take advantage of the international war crisis. He, this is in Japan with the Shibusawa family. The old Shibusawa was, of course, the pioneer in Japanese financial and banking reform in the Meiji era. This was the third generation who was governor of the Reserve Bank. He was staying at their home with the family. But this is fascinating, I thought, that here in the middle of the Second World War, he decides to go to the Ueno Museum of Art, knowing very well, of course, that, you know, there had been all these exchanges between India and Japan in the domain of painting and also, you know, poetry and so forth. So he went to the Museum of Art. He heard that Noguchi had written a poem for NHK on to Delhi, and he asked for a translation. He was a bilingual poet, Noguchi, in Japanese and English. And it was a it's a very powerful poem, which I have reproduced in part in this book. He's talking about waiting for a feast in the land of famine. This was a 1943 poem by Noguchi. I've mentioned in passing Sarojini Naidu. She was the key figure, in my view, at the Asian Relations Conference here in Delhi in April of 1947. Absolutely, glorious speeches that she delivered, both at the beginning and the end of the conference. And she could also be very sarcastic. She said, I had sent out a letter of invitation to other Asians to come. And the European countries thought that, this was, waving a, red rag in front of centuries of Western civilization. But again, sort of, it's, we've talked quite a lot about, and there's been a lot written about Nehru at the Asian Relations Conference, and Gandhi came there, of course, and he urged the Asian visitors not to take away memories of the carnage that was taking place. This is April 1947. But Sarojini Naidu figures in my book as the main character there. She had actually been supposed to preside over an all-Asian women's conference in Lahore in 1931. She couldn't because she was in jail for taking part in Gandhi's civil disobedience movement, but she was there in the spring of 1947. And so already in this period, you're beginning to bring Africa in, certainly West Asia, all the way from Lebanon to the eastern extremity. Japan couldn't come because they had just lost the war. But then I think what becomes very clear, in Bandung, there was African representation, but there was a curious decision made, and that I feel was the statist bias of that moment, that representatives of the freedom movements were not given a place at the table. And most of Africa was still not free. And therefore, it was the participation of Africa was very limited. But in fact, what I do in this book is to write about a whole range of civil society initiatives in the decade of the 1950s. There were Asians and also Africans sort of coming together. Just as I mentioned, Du Bois was in Japan in the mid-1930s, when, for example, an Asia-Pacific Peace Conference was hosted in Beijing. What you find is that, okay, this was Gandhi at the Asian Relations Conference. There was a preparatory meeting in June for an October conference. And what kind of mural do you see? A mural copy hanging behind the main speakers, The Nightmare of War, Dream of Peace by Diego Rivera. And interestingly, since Ram is here, I should mention Didi Kosambi was there and at this preparatory meeting. Before that, I write about Katie Shah's visit. As the opposition's presidential candidate, he was in China, and he probably has the most insightful book on China in that period. And he had just come back. Didi Kosambi had gone, and then eventually this conference was held in October. And one of the strategies, you talked about writing. So one of the literary strategies that I have adopted in this book is to, bring back characters, some well-known, others whom I have rescued from undeserved oblivion, in successive chapters. And so what I've tried to do is to weave together, many threads of stories to somehow present an Asian tapestry for the reader, much like Bengali weavers produce a Jamdani sari. So that's what I was trying to do. And this is a horse by Shu Bei Hong.
Mm.
M.F. Hussain was there in October of 1952. And of course, he greatly admired Chi Bai Shi, whom Tagore had met in 1924. And he described Chi Bai Shi as the Métis of Asia. But he then went to the studio of Shu Bei Hong, the same painter who had been in Shantiniketan in 1940. And there he saw Shu Bei Hong's 1,000 horses. I'm just showing you one. And that is what inspired Hussain to give his own horses a new kind of strength and vigor. So these were the kinds of Asian conversations that were continuing. It wasn't just Avanindranath Tagore and Taikan at the beginning of the 20th century. Even in the 1950s, these were the kinds of exchanges that were taking place. So yeah. So, and Africa, what I will say is that it's in the unofficial meetings, not the conferences like Bandung, that Africa got a bigger presence. So just before Bandung, there was a meeting in Delhi, and Maulana Bhashani was here representing Pakistan and so forth, calling for the blessings of Allah for Bandung, but this was a non-official meeting. And then just after Bandung, in 1957, there was again an unofficial meeting, this time in Cairo. And, Nasser's prestige was high after the Suez Crisis. And there, because it was sort of a semi-official meeting, the representatives of all of the African freedom movements were there. And the other point to mention is that women's participation and, gender on the agenda of these meetings tended to be much higher in the unofficial meetings. In Bandung, you don't see very many women, and you read all the resolutions, there's hardly anything about gender. But you look at all of the other unofficial or semi-official meetings, including the one in Cairo, just after Bandung, and there you see freedom movements represented, not just states, youth, women playing a much more active role. So that's how I think this, connections across what we now call the Global South were forged. And again, one other point about that Beijing conference, African-American labor leaders came, because just as there could be African-Asian conferences, there were also Asia-Pacific conferences. So there was a very famous African-American labor leader called Louis Wheaton, who actually brokered some kind of an agreement on Kashmir between the Indian delegation led by Saifuddin Kichlu and the Pakistan delegation led by Pir Manki Sharif. And there were Indian and Pakistani women as well who showered each other with flowers because they just blamed the machinations of the Anglo-American imperialists and the ineptitude of the United Nations for all these problems. But the British had hoped that Kashmir would divide the Asians, when in fact they were trying to unite on Malaya and Korea and so forth. But exactly the opposite happened at an unofficial meeting. And with the participation of African-American participants from across the Pacific Ocean.
What you're saying, and I'm mindful of time because I do want to let everybody here also participate and ask questions. So this is going to be my last question. But what you've just said, it kind of brings me to what I was already thinking about, that whole post-Bandung period, which is when you describe, this is already now a continent that is fractured. It is already politically, and in terms of, if you like, the statist orientations, it's moving in very different directions. Yet in your book, you seem to emphasize much more the continuity in terms of people's interactions, cultural, social, intellectual, philosophical, and so on. And so just very briefly, if you can tell us a little bit about that, and also what does that mean today, when it's, if anything, more fractured than ever? Where does it lead us then in terms of how we view Asia?
Even though I have sounded a bit critical about the statist bias in Bandung, and and I think that that was a problem, but even so, I think that practically all of the Asian leaders displayed a level of statesmanship so that they could, in the end, issue a joint communique and so on. Because sometimes when we just look back at Bandung, we tend to assume that this was just the beginning of the non-aligned movement and so on. But in addition to, India and, Indonesia, and of course, Chuen Lai was there representing China, there were, all kinds of Asian states who were represented. Pakistan was there, which had already joined SEATO. Turkey was there, which had already joined NATO, and so on. But this Philippines was there, which was very much in the American camp. But they at least had the good sense to still, forge something of a common purpose. So I would give that much. But what tended to happen, especially post-Bandung, late 1950s, and I have described so much of the bonhomie among Asian countries, and Japan, of course, made an entry back into Asia at Bandung, and that's again something that is not often emphasized. Shigemitsu, who had been the wartime foreign minister, who had been the host of the Tokyo Conference of 1943, was foreign minister in 1955. And he more or less negotiated Japan's quiet entry back onto the international diplomatic stage. So those were certain achievements of Bandung. But I think that in the late 1950s, you had managers of post-colonial states relying rather too heavily on European concepts of unitary sovereignty, of hard borders, and so on. And so you began to see a new round of nation-state conflicts, of which one dramatic example, of course, was the border war between India and China in 1962. And much of it, of course, was fought here. I was in Arunachal Pradesh just a few years ago, and this is the Sila Pass, where so much of that war took place. So, but you're right. I point out that even at this time of nation-state conflicts, there were, it's exactly in 1960 that there was a very fine Japanese scholar of Chinese literature called Takeuchi Yoshimi, who gave a speech, and it became a very influential essay called Asia as Method. And those who are writing on Asian history now tend to go back to that sort of essay, and actually suggesting in both theoretical and practical terms how one could recover some kind of a spirit of Asian universalism, shorn of that, awful aberration, as it was seen, of nationalistic imperialism and conflicts. And so I also show the art of that period. If, this is in the early 1960s. Nandalal Bose is painting and indeed celebrating the Indian countryside in the Japanese sumie style. And he has many such paintings, even if you look at his signature. It is 3362, So these kinds of cultural artistic exchanges continued. Now, to be very brief, I think that, the heyday of the nation state in Asia lasted up to the late 1980s or early 1990s. And it seemed to me that in the late 20th and the very early 21st century, there were possibilities of a new kind of reconnected Asia. And had I put out this book around 2013, I may have painted a more optimistic picture towards the end. But it's a much more sober appraisal of what is going on in Asia, or what has transpired in Asia in the last decade or so. And you will see that I discuss Wang Gongwu's book, Renewal, where he had suggested that there were alternative possibilities even for China as late as 2013. And, a Chinese scholar called Gu Hongbing, whom Binoy Kumar Sarkar had met in 1915-16, was becoming popular again in China. But as I say, Gu Hongbing's vision has been swept aside now by Xi Jinping's thought, and that makes things much more problematic. But I still try to end on a somewhat hopeful note, saying that, the best attributes of the imagination of Asia, or a kind of pluralized continentalism, can in fact make for a better future. So we are at an uncertain crossroads, but I suggest, what are the inheritances that we ought to take on this difficult journey ahead?
Well, I think all of you will agree that's been a very tantalizing sort of introduction to this book. So I'm sure many of you will now want to go and read it. But before that, if you have any questions, now we have some time. Okay, right in front and then followed by you. Go ahead. Maybe you need the mic because I think there's a Zoom audience as well. So, and if you can give your name as well. Just speak, it'll probably start.
It's working, yeah.
It's working?
I think so. Is it working?
No. Why don't you just come up here? I think there's another mic. Oh, there's a mic. Yeah. Yeah, just.
My name is Ishan Fawzdar. I'm a master's student at JNU. So my question is around nation state. Joya Chatterjee recently not recently, but she came out with a book called Shadows at Noon, in which she sort of tries to So in which she tries to show that the concept of South Asia is not, so she's basically trying to show that India, Bangladesh, Pakistan are not as different as they have been constructed post the partition. But she's only talking about South Asia. My question to you is, that after the colonial experience that India, of the Indian subcontinent, we had the critique of colonialism by post-colonial scholars. And today we have the critique through a decolonial, the terminology of decoloniality has been on the rise. But do you think that post-colonial and decolonial thinking both have not critiqued the idea of nation state to the extent that they should have? Because, even in the writings of Said or Fanon, they see nationalism as therapeutic, as a pushback against colonialism. But again, there's an ambivalence towards the idea of the nation state in post-colonial thought. But in the recent Hindu nationalist thought, the idea of decoloniality has came in, which is sort of trying to mold the idea of nation state into sort of a Hindu civilization state, which I think,
so
yeah.
I think you've got the
So
question.
do you think that nation state has not
Yeah.
been criticized enough?
Yeah, the first thing that I would say is that that the classic European nation-state model was always held in suspicion. That most anti-colonial political thinkers of the first few decades of the 20th century were skeptical of the European nation-state model. And side by side with grand ideas of an Asiatic federation that had been expounded by a whole range of Asian leaders, not just Indian, Sun Yat-sen, for example, of China and so on. And even in the 1940s, Aung San was talking in those terms. There was something else, which is that there was a sense that many of these countries in Asia were very diverse, and that unity even within these countries could only be of a federal type. that there needs to be, a real respect for differences within. And even though the nation-state idea became the norm in international relations, particularly from 1919 onwards, this was consistently challenged, even for the next, 2.5 decades across Asia. However, what we do find is that, if we simply look at formal political decolonization, most countries, in some ways, ended up with the unitary states that had been constructed by European imperialists. Sometimes we make an easy distinction between empire and nation. But in fact, I think it's more important to talk about different types of empire. Pre-colonial empires had been very different from the European colonial empires. And anti-colonial thought even in the early 20th century had always challenged, these colonial nations, notions of sovereignty and borders. But we inherited many of those. And I suppose to your answer, I will say yes, that there was much in post-colonial sort of criticism that did not, directly take on the fact that, these nation states were really just successors of the colonial states, centralized colonial states, and that was not sufficiently criticized. However, we have to be very wary of what is being talked about in the name of decolonization or a decolonial civilizational state today, because I don't think that there is any real challenge to in those ideas of the over-centralized, state monolith, and all that is happening is perhaps translating colonial era laws into Sanskritic Hindi, making them even more oppressive than they had been in the colonial era, and passing all that off as decolonization. So we need to be wary of that trend.
Okay, so we have here and then Ram. And anybody else, if you would just put your hand up, I will know. We have 2 questions online. Okay, so after those 2, yes. Yes, if you speak. Yeah.
So my question is was there any attempt to have one Asian Union? This is my question number 1. The second question is related to Jayati Ghosh. What is your take on Jayati Ghosh?
2 very different questions. Yes, if we are talking about the idea of an Asiatic federation in the realm of political thought in Asia, it was significant. It was important. And, very many major figures talked in those terms, all the way from the beginning of the 20th century, certainly up until the end of the 1940s. Were there, practical, moves at that sort beyond conferences, such as the official Bandung one or the non-official ones? The answer is probably no. And the best regional associations that have come up have been limited to certain parts of Asia, not embracing the whole. Rashbihari Bose is a fascinating figure. Of course, he escaped to Japan in 1915, and that's where he lived for the next 30 years. And probably the most interesting intellectual contributions from Rashbihari Bose were made in his journal called New Asia, which came out from 1933 onwards. And what he was saying was very similar to the arguments of Du Bois about the global color line. And he was, in fact, talking about the unity of all of the oppressed peoples across Asia and Africa already at that time. And also it's, something that's forgotten because only his Second World War period or what he said in the late 30s gets to be cited today. But he was, also someone who was saying that Japan should recognize the Soviet Union in the 1920s and so forth, wanting a rapprochement between, the new Japan and the Soviet Union. Part of that overlapping universalism that I was talking about between Asian universalism and communist internationalism. So he is actually quite a fascinating figure, and he and Ananda Mohan Sahai were key political operatives from India in that interwar period in Japan.
Ram,
You talked a lot about.
can you hold it like this?
Sorry, you
Yeah.
talked a lot about the literature exchange, philosophy, politics, art. What about science and technology? Do you cover that in your book, especially because there was a lot of common interest, the small dams in China, for example, and small scale industries that were over here. So,
I probably don't talk as much about the exchanges in the field of science and technology, which as a scientist you would have wanted. But I do have references to those kinds of, scientific dialogues that took place across Asian borders. But there I tend to, rely on works of other colleagues. A younger generation of historians has done wonderful work on different aspects of these Asian connections. And without their work, it would not have been possible for me to just, produce this, grand work of interpretation covering, all of Asia. So just to give you an example, my colleague Jayati Ghosh has been doing some quite interesting work on scientific exchanges, and already in his published work he has written about how there were exchanges between India and China in the field of statistics and development planning, this is during the period of India-China bonhomie. Chu Enlai came and went to the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. Then Mahalanobis and his team, went to China. There were Chinese statisticians in India even in the late 1950s, 1958, 59. But then the Great Leap Forward in China meant, and then the war in 1962 meant that all of those kinds of cooperation in the field of science, of statistics, of development planning suddenly came to a crashing end, because there was a moment when China was becoming a little skeptical of what the Soviet Union was offering. And therefore, there was, this whole business about Asianism is what I call, what I'm talking about are interconnections and sort of an interreferential Asia, a desire among Asians to learn from one another in different fields that was going on in science and technology as well.
just add
Yeah.
a comment. Even today,
Can you hold it this
yeah,
way?
even today, what happens is that all the Asian countries are looking to the
West.
global north
Yes.
for intellectual validation and so on.
Mhm.
It's a pity that
Mm.
the inter
Yeah.
or intra-Asian federation in science at least didn't take off.
Yeah.
We have two questions online, I think. So if someone could read them out. Yeah, great.
Professor Bose, there are two questions. The first one is from Anup Kumar Dey. They say, how is India emerging as a global leader across various domains, from embracing agroecological practices like natural farming and promoting sustainable food transformation to pioneering initiatives such as the adoption of central digital currency and facilitating the development of Web3 technologies and decentralized autonomous organizations? This shift in leadership, especially in the wake of saturation of innovation and opportunities in the USA, is drawing attention from the leadership worldwide. marking a significant paradigm shift post-colonial era. So,
Is there a second question? I'm going to hand over this question to Jayati. She is much more competent to address that question than I am. Yeah, and yeah.
the second question is from Manaswini Sen. They say, thank you, Professor Bose, for that insightful talk. Not sticking to stereotypes, but can Sarkar's affinity towards Nazism and his hailing it as a form of benevolent dictatorship, that's in quotes. If I'm not wrong, it was Manjapra's take, be traced to his visits to Japan. As in, the Japanese imperialist assertion had undeniably influenced Indian anti-colonial imaginations in the first half of the 20th century. Did you get any such proof while you rummaged through his work that can entertain this view?
You want to?
Why don't
Take
you
the
go
first
ahead and do the...
Yeah, okay. Again, with all of these major intellectuals, they went through different phases. If, in fact, Binoy Sarkar exhibited some degree of admiration for, European totalitarianism, it was, in the 1930s. That was based on his travels in Europe and his study of European politics. I am talking here of a Binoy Kumar Sarkar of the second decade of the 20th century, when he is visiting both Japan and China, and he's prepared to sort of learn. And I think he has the most fascinating insights into what could be the basis for building a new kind of, Asian solidarity. What needs to be dismissed straight away is this notion, based on absolutely no evidence and none of his writings, that he could be compared to Savarkar, which is what Niall Green has done in a recent book on Asia. And that is why in my book, I actually quote at length, particularly from his Bengali works. But again, what I also show is that many of these Swadeshi internationalists, they were very peripatetic in the second decade, even into the third decade of the 20th century. Not just Binoy Sarkar, think about M.N. Roy, who's a major figure in this story of overlapping universalisms. Or think about Lala Lajpat Rai. He traveled to Japan and Turkey in addition to the United States and so on. But many of these figures, during the 30s, during the Depression decade, became rather more sedentary and stationary. Even a Binoy Kumar Sarkar or an M.N. Roy began to write much more about national political economy and so on in that period. Chris Manjapra was my first PhD student after I moved to Harvard in 2001, so I know his work well, and I actually think that he's on the mark on what he has to say about Binoy Sarkar in relation to his study of the intellectual encounters between India and Germany. But there is a Binoy Kumar Sarkar that needed to be recovered from oblivion, as I put it, who was, in fact, a formidable intellectual and an absolutely fascinating, colorful cosmopolitan.
Okay, I suppose I should address at least some of the issues that have been raised in that first question online. So, just in general, I think it's important when we take pride in the achievements of Indian civilization or Indian society and economy, to have a degree of realism and not be overtaken by what we would like the rest of the world to perceive about us. So in terms of agroecology, it is certainly very important. There are some very major and important interventions happening at the micro level, largely done by civil society, by NGOs, etc., with very little public support. In fact, we have a farmers' movement. We have thousands of farmers literally waiting at the gates of Delhi, not being allowed in as we speak. And one of their demands is precisely to be enabled to actually go in for more agroecological techniques, rather than rely on very aggressively agrochemical-based industry, which is depleting the soil, which is also reducing the nutrition content of the crops that are grown. And one of the methods that they have argued for is a support price that is guaranteed, that would ensure that you could actually do those agroecological techniques. So yes, we definitely need that, for sure. But I don't think we can claim that we've got there. And there are other countries that are doing a much better job of it. I could mention Cuba, for example, which is now a pioneer in terms of genuine ecologically sustainable cultivation, partly because they had to, but the point is that they did it. Similarly, I think digital, it's a very complex thing, the expansion of the digital identification as a basis for delivery of public services. And there are reasons why it tends to be preferred more by authoritarian governments. I mean, China is a big advocate of it, even though even China has not gone in for biometric identification, recognizing that it's a very dangerous thing, especially for populations that have a lot of manual work and so on. The use of digital methods as the basis for providing online services is something that has been interrogated by many countries. And it's not something that we picked up on our own. We actually copied it from the more authoritarian governments around. But it is not necessarily a huge sign of progress. I would say it's mixed in many ways. Certainly, there are many advantages of the digital technology. I'm not by any means saying we shouldn't be doing it. They're wonderful, but. And finally, central bank digital currencies. Hey, we haven't got one. There are countries in the world who have it. It's a complicated one again. I certainly am an advocate of it. I think we should be doing it. But it's not something that is a creation of India in particular. In fact, it's been much more advanced in the Latin American countries.
Let me just say a final word. First of all, thank you, Jayati. I was an agrarian and environmental historian in an earlier incarnation, so you were much better placed to answer that question. What I would like to add is that we should be very careful about, drawing boundaries around so-called civilizations. What this study of Asia actually shows, that there were no such boundaries, that there were flows across space, and there were dramatic changes over time. And, that's intrinsic to the story of imagining, Asia in the long 20th century. And of course, we also need to be, rejecting this idea of drawing rigid borders around nation states. So I'll end with something that I quote from Tagore. I mean, I quote in, I think, my introductory chapter. I mean, way back in 1932, when he went to Iran as part of his essays, which became his book Paroshe, he had already been writing about the potential rise of Asia. But what he said, that if Asia has to rise, let Asia speak in its, own authentic voice. If we simply imitate Europe's beastly cry, then even if it were to be the lion's roar, it will be a loss. And that warning, I think, needs to be taken seriously by all Asians, especially as we are seeing a new kind of rise of authoritarianism, sometimes in a democratic garb, in so many countries across Asia.
I think that's a great note to end on, and I think we all need to thank Sugata for a very fascinating and interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ghosh and Professor Bose. I think it was wonderful discussion, deeply, thoroughly enjoyed by everyone. Thank you so much. They're here, I think, maybe for a few more minutes if anybody has a question, but I think we'll wrap up for the day. Hoping you all have a great evening. Reach back safely. I know some people have traveled far as Sonipat, I know. So thank you very much, but stay safe. You're crossing a border that's very, fragile at this point. But thank you all, audience, for coming. Thank you so much again, both of you. It was a wonderful session. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay.
Why do you use the word long?